My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to answer the question, is trauma the missing link to success? And I also want to talk about, is post-traumatic growth even possible? So I want to start off with talking about the causes of what really causes Cptsd and Ptsd, and why it can cause lifelong issues for individuals. And then I want to give you about 4 examples to be able to answer the questions that I had posed to you. Now, I could use 1,000 examples, so I'm thinking that this show is going to be we're going to do more than one show, so let me just say that. So let's take it from the beginning. What are the causes of Cptsd and Ptsd? And typically what we're looking at, there's a lot of things, but it's ongoing, repetitive, physical, sexual, emotional, and verbal abuse. And of course, we could also add neglect to that, which is also ongoing and repetitive. Now, you're going to hear me say this a lot today, ongoing and repetitive, so just keep that in mind. So we're also looking at repetitive rejection, abandonment, invalidation of the child, and a disruption in healthy attachment. In addition, we're looking at repetitive undermining of a child's safety and security. And as we looked at last week, Cptsd can also be caused by coddling children and undermining their ability to be themselves and undermining their ability to differentiate. So we have a lot of ways that trauma can be caused. But this also is horrible because it can be lifelong issues. And typically it is for most people because they don't necessarily do the right things or they don't go to treatment in order to fix this. So we're looking at, again, ongoing physical and emotional deprivation in childhood. It can be a lifelong issue, and actually most of the time, unfortunately, it is. Why is this though? And this is important to know, because if we know it, maybe we can do something about it. So one of the reasons why it could become, and I say could, not definitely, it could become a lifelong issue is because it can destroy a child's self-esteem. And without a healthy self-esteem, it's hard to be a person of achievement in this world. Number 2, it can also create negative core beliefs in the child. It can also create negative core beliefs in what they feel about other people. In other words, they don't trust people. And it can also create negative core beliefs about the world, such as the world is a very scary, invalidating place that they need to be afraid of. Let's talk about number 3. It can also be a lifelong problem because it can create very negative life scripts in a child. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that a child's perception of themselves and their identity, or what they feel that their identity is, can definitely ruin a lot of the rest of their life. They might feel like they're helpless, they're hopeless, they're incompetent, that everybody else around them is okay, but they are not okay. And if they have a life script like this, obviously it's not conducive to having a very happy, productive, successful life. So it seems very negative at this point. In other words, again, to go back to the original question, is trauma the missing link to success? So far it looks like that there's no possible way in the world that could be. And is post-traumatic growth even possible? Right now it doesn't look very good, but let's delve a little deeper into life scripts. So I want to read this to you. And the reason why I want to read it is because I don't think I can do a better job than this person. This is about perfect, and it definitely makes a couple of points that are extremely important in order to answer our question today. So let's take it from the top. A life script is a set of childhood decisions made unconsciously by a person in response to parental messages about themselves, others, and the world. We kind of went over that a little bit. The next part. These decisions are influenced by the child's perception and interpretation of what's happening around him or her. So this explains why two children brought up in the same household could have diametrically opposite personalities. Now, as a quick little example, I was thinking about this myself. If you look at somebody like Bill Clinton, okay, take the politics out, okay, because I need you to hear what I'm saying. If you're not into his politics, I don't care, that's not the point. But if you look at somebody like Bill Clinton, his father died before he was born. So incredible trauma. Bill Clinton lived in a trailer park with his mother, who had married multiple people throughout the years. One of the people she married was an alcoholic that used to beat up him and his brother, or his, I think it was his stepbrother. Now, if we look at it, let's just fast forward. Bill Clinton became the President of the United States 2 times. His brother, do you even know him? Well, he was completely unsuccessful. Nobody really knows him, and he was probably, well, he's known to be an alcoholic, even though I shouldn't probably say that. Now, another quick example, take somebody like Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter has been successful at everything he's ever done in life. And he was also the President of the United States. His brother, this guy's been arrested for being drunk in public, urinating in public, and doing every other thing that would embarrass a family. So you could see the diametric differences here, even coming from the same household. So let's move on. In terms of life scripts, a mother could tell both of her sons, you are both going to end up in a mental hospital someday. And it could actually come true. Whereas one of the children ends up being a patient at the mental hospital, and one of the children ends up being the doctor at the mental hospital. They receive the same message, but they interpret it differently. So as we're looking at this, we have to go back to what the ancient Stoics said, that it's not about the event, it's about the interpretation of the event. So going back to the original question now, is trauma the missing link to success? Maybe yes, maybe no. Because technically it's not the trauma itself that does anything. The trauma, although we can say it's obviously a very negative, bad thing, thus the word trauma, for some people, they grow from the trauma and they do extraordinarily well. And for some people, they do extraordinarily poor. So it's not the trauma that's the missing link. It's the interpretation of it and what we do with that trauma in order to get past it and through it. So that's where our answers are where they're gonna lie. Let's move to some examples. One example is just something that I've done. It's September now, but in August was the 10-year anniversary of when I started doing a radio show. And this radio show was called From Grief to Relief. And in this show, I had never done a radio show before at all, but I was on a regular radio station. There were about 25 different programs. And we ended up being in the top 3 almost every week. And how did we do this? Because I was a great DJ? No, I was terrible at it. But the idea was great. And the idea, again, grief to relief, what I did was I basically scoured my environment for business people, sports people, and anybody else who wanted to talk about the struggles, obstacles, and adversities that they had overcome. And in a very short amount of time, it became the program that almost everybody wanted to do. I think in 7 years, I was turned down once. One person said that they were a little apprehensive about talking about their stuff on the air. But everybody else was lined up, and who knew? But they were so proud of their achievements about being able to overcome problems that they wanted to talk about it because they wanted to be an inspiration for other people. And so my perspective is, again, can we overcome our trauma to be better? Because I think in therapy all the time, we spend way too much time on the trauma and we say, oh, it's so bad, and I understand, and it's terrible. And we keep talking about the trauma so much, but we don't talk about the empowerment part of it. Like I said, I had a show for 7 years, and I couldn't stop people from coming in the door wanting to talk about how they overcame their issues. Just my own personal experience. Let's talk about the Cradles of Eminence book. They studied the childhoods of over 400 of the most successful people. But that was the original. They actually bumped it up. So they ended up studying 700 childhoods of successful people. So the question is, what is success? According to this book, it was two things. Number one, something that you have had to have done to help out society. That's number one. And number two, you had to have had at least 2 biographies written about you. So we're not talking about your average successful person, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, that's great. But we're talking about like amazingly, it's like incredible successful people, obviously with 2 biographies written about them. So that's the type of people that they studied. What they came up with is this: only 15% of them lived in a supportive home. Quick little math, that leads 85% of these highly achieving people lived in an unsupportive home, 85% of them. And of that 85%, 75% came from outright abusive homes with severe problems. So out of the 700 people that they studied that were top achievers, 75% came from places that were severe in their punishment, severe in their traumas. Think about that for a second. So if you're listening to this going, oh, I've had trauma, I don't know if I could do well. Take a look at some of this evidence for you, and I'm going to show you more. This book concludes that a person with a quote unquote that comes from a normal home, you will not, and you probably cannot be a candidate for the Hall of Fame. Think about that. So if you're coming from a difficult situation right now, you should be thankful. I mean, I don't know if that's a hard thing to be able to teach people, to be thankful for their traumas. But the evidence points to that. So I'm not saying I want people to go through trauma. However, evidence tells us that if you can go through obstacles, you can become better. It is a choice. Let's move to another example. 80% of millionaires were not A students in school. A lot of them didn't go to college either, by the way. So we're talking about, a lot of them weren't A students in high school. Most of them around the B and C area, basically average. How did they become exceptional? Well, their success was correlated to mental toughness. Their success was correlated to emotional toughness. How did they get this? Because they were able to delay gratification, and they were people who would never quit, and they would never take failure as the last word. They would continue. That's just some of the ways that they were. But how did they get to be that way? They weren't born that way. And you're going to hear these same words again. I told you we're going to hear it before. They became this way because they had a life of ongoing, repetitive, daily struggles, pitfalls, and deprivation. How interesting is that? Because that's the same exact environment that breeds PTSD and Cptsd. So that same environment also breeds success, achievement, and wisdom. It's incredibly important that we know that. Let me say that again. Ongoing, daily, repetitive struggles, pitfalls, and deprivation may cause Cptsd, but it also may cause achievement, success, and wisdom. That becomes your choice now, doesn't it? Very interesting stuff. Another example I want to use today that I think is an amazing example, because I haven't really heard too many people talk about it, but I think it's a really good one. And it's one of my biggest interests in the world. I mean, you see The Who behind me here, and you see Jimi Hendrix. Let's talk about classic rock for a second. Yes, it's applicable to our situation today. And here's why. Let's think about classic rock. Classic rock basically started with the Beatles in 1962. Fast forward, you're looking at 60 years later, where their music is just as popular as it was in the 60s. Now, the principal players of classic rock, we're going to go over that in a second. They have shown amazing commitment, amazing dedication. They write, they play, they record. And they're still touring today, even though they are pushing 80 years old. How is that possible? How is it possible that a human being could be that dedicated, number one, to continue to push forward? I mean, I know people, they have to travel somewhere and they go through the airport and they're like, oh my God, it was such a tough deal to do. Like, the airports are just so annoying. These 80-year-old men are still traveling the world as we speak. And they've done it for 60 years. And they've had families here and so, but they still are putting all their effort into music. Now, there's also a reason why they're able to last that long. It's because of the music that they're writing was original. Now, each of the bands I'm going to mention, they are considered to be classic rock, but yet each of them have their own sound. They write about their own things. They're completely creative. And they've been able to touch the heart and souls of not thousands, millions of people for 60 years. Never before in the history of music has that happened. And it won't happen. It almost can't happen. So that's the backdrop of classic rock. Okay, so what am I talking about? Here's the thing. What do these people have in common? And just in case you don't know, I'm just going to go down a quick list. I don't know if you're into music or not, but we're going to go over a quick list so you know kind of who I'm talking about. So we look at the Beatles, 1962. The Rolling Stones, 1963. The Who, 1964. From there we have Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Eric Clapton. You can throw in Rod Stewart if you want, and you can throw in David Bowie if you want. Here we're looking at the base of all classic rock, that 60 years later it's still here. All different sounds, they all write different types of music. What do they have in common? What can we learn? Well, let's take a look. Paul McCartney, born 1942. Mick Jagger, born 1943. The guys in The Who, principal players, born in 44. The guys in Led Zeppelin, 1944. The guys in Pink Floyd, 1943. Eric Clapton, 1945. And David Bowie, who's unfortunately died, but he was actually a little bit younger than these people. He died in 1947. So what does that have to do with anything? I'm going to show you. Number one thing that they all have in common. They're all from England. England. All of the greatest musicians that have lasted the test of time for 60 years. All were born in the same place. How is that possible? England must be massive, right? No, it's not. England is the size of Alabama. In a relatively small place like Alabama is where you could find every great musician that has lasted the test of time since 1962. What else? What could be going on? What's in the water in England? Let me tell you. What happened on July 10th, 1940? the Germans started bombing England. That's what happened. And that lasted all the way through May 8th, 1945. So every person that I just mentioned to you, that is an amazing musician, that understands the hearts and souls of human beings, that had dedication and commitment, they were born in a war. And not just born in a war, the most massive amount of PTSD you could ever imagine. They were conceived in a war. Their mothers went through 9 months while listening to bombs going off in their town, whereas London itself was being demolished to the ground. There were practically no buildings in London. It was getting bombed on a daily basis. That's how these mothers went through their pregnancy. You think they had a little stress? Of course. You think the fathers had stress? Absolutely. But here's the thing too. A lot of those fathers weren't there. They were in the war. How many of them came back? I don't know, but a lot of them didn't. So the people that we're talking about that created classic rock music were born in a war. Everybody around them had PTSD. Everybody in England had PTSD. Let's continue with this. As they were born, and I read Roger Daltrey's biography, his mother gave birth to him in a hospital that had holes in the roof. So like when people talk about, oh, I had this little PTSD problem, I had this issue in my life, so I can't be anybody, we need to start looking at some examples of role models, of people that have had massive trauma in their life, but they actually don't talk about it. People in Britain, they got that stiff upper lip. They don't talk about it. They just do their job. Here's something that's interesting. As soon as that war started for England, they went into food restriction. So the food restriction started about 1940. Do you know when the food restriction stopped? 1954, 9 years after the war. Think about this. So if you're Paul McCartney, for example, and you were born in 1942, you were about 12 or 13 years old before you could actually eat to your desire. Until then, the amount of bread they had, the amount of butter they had, the amount of milk they had was rationed. And think about this in terms of how you connect to human beings. If you had a friend and you wanted a friend to come over the house to enjoy dinner with you or a snack, you didn't have extra food. It was rationed. So you had to give up, if you had a sandwich and you had 2 slices of bread, you had to have a sandwich with 1 slice of bread and then give the other half to your friend. So people learned how to have a community, to care about people, to understand what's important, to know what love is, to know what joy is, to be grateful for things. And as these artists grew up, they were looking at parents that had massive PTSD. As these musicians were growing up and looking at their parents, what happened was too, is that at night, everybody had to turn off their lights. Why? Because when the Nazis were flying over England, they could see the lights and they became targets. So what happened was that everybody in England would turn off their lights so it would be just darkness. So you would sit there with your children in the dark, being scared to death that that would be your last moment with your family, because it was for a lot of people. And that's how these children were brought up, in massive trauma. When these children, and children by I mean Paul McCartney, John Lennon, all these great artists, when they walked to school, what do you think, London was built in a second after the war? No, they were walking over rubble. They were walking over dust and bricks and rock. And half the time they didn't really have real schools. This is how they lived until they were like teenagers. It's amazing. I read a story about Roger Daltrey talking about how all the parents had PTSD from the war, is that every time there was a thunder or lightning storm, everybody was like, they were scared to death because it sounded like bombs going off. So again, this is how the children had to grow up. Now think about the emotional connection between the children and the parents at this time, when the parents are always stressed out, always scared, always going through this food anxiety and everything else. So that is the environment that the greatest musicians in the world grew up in. Back to the original question. Is trauma the missing link to success? Have I proven at all or indicated or suggested in any way that trauma, it might be the missing link to success? Absolutely. But it's not the trauma itself. It's how you react to that trauma. And is post-traumatic growth possible? I see it every day. Every day of my life, I do. Every time I hear music from a classic rock artist, I hear it every day as well. Post-traumatic growth is around us all the time. And I think we need to open up our eyes, our hearts, our brains, our ears to all of it. Instead of having this negative feeling all the time that we keep coddling our kids because we don't want them to have to jump over any, obstacles or go through any hoops in their life. When there's plenty of evidence out there to show that if you can teach the child to deal with issues in an appropriate way, it's much better than trying to avoid the issues of life. My name is Joe Prony. This is the Rise Above Project, and hopefully you've seen some value in this show. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.